The spark that ignited 30 years of chaos. On a spring morning in Prague, 3 men sailed through the air. Their fall from a castle window would ignite the most destructive conflict Europe had seen, a war that began with a medieval act of vengeance and ended by birthing the modern world. The Catholic officials who plummeted 60 feet that day survived, claiming divine intervention. The Protestant nobles who threw them blamed a fortuitous pile of manure. Either way, this moment of violence would spiral into 30 years of chaos that would reshape continents, dethrone kings, and leave 8 million dead in its wake. This is not merely another war story. It's a tale of zealous emperors and brilliant generals, of warrior queens and scheming cardinals, of Swedish kings who revolutionized warfare, and French ministers who turned religious fury into political art. From the ashes of medieval Europe's last holy war, our modern concepts of international relations, religious tolerance, and state sovereignty would emerge. But first, the continent would burn. A powder keg called Bohemia. Ferdinand of Styria knelt before the crucifix in his private chapel, as he did every morning. The future Emperor Ferdinand II's devotions weren't mere ritual, they were the foundation of his very existence. As a boy in Bavaria, his mother had drilled into him an unshakable conviction. It was his divine mission to purge heresy from his lands, whatever the cost. Now, in 1617, as he surveyed his future inheritance of Bohemia, he saw a kingdom infested with Protestant infection. The Jesuits who had educated him would be proud of what he was about to unleash. Across Prague, in the great halls of Bohemian nobility, Protestant lords clutched their hard-won letter of majesty, a royal decree guaranteeing their religious freedoms. They had extracted this precious document from Ferdinand's predecessor, Rudolf II, but they knew Ferdinand. They had watched his systematic elimination of Protestantism in his home territory of Styria. Count Heinrich Matthias von Thurn, fierce-eyed and sharp-tongued, gathered his fellow nobles in secret meetings. "Better to die with swords in hand," he thundered, "than wait for the executioner's axe." The wheels of catastrophe were already turning in the sprawling Holy Roman Empire. In its tangle of semi-independent states, princes could choose their realm's religion, but their subjects had to follow or flee. The Peace of Augsburg that had maintained this precarious balance for 60 years was cracking. Catholics controlled the south, Protestants the north, and Bohemia sat like a Protestant island in Catholic seas, wealthy, strategic, and increasingly terrified. In Bavaria, Ferdinand's cousin Maximilian built an army. In Spain, Ferdinand's Habsburg relatives counted their gold. In the Protestant Palatinate, a young ruler named Frederick dreamed of a crown. And in Prague, in taverns and townhouses, in churches and castle halls, men began to whisper of defiance. The moths were circling the flame, unaware that their dance would set all Europe ablaze. Through the fractured territories of the empire, merchants brought news of Protestant Union troops drilling in town squares, of Catholic League forces massing along borders. The Dutch Republic sent gold north, Spain sent it south, and England's James sent meaningless promises in all directions. But in Bohemia, in that summer of 1617, it was still just whispers. Just nobles meeting in shadows. Just a zealous Catholic prince praying before his crucifix. Just a fuse waiting for a spark. The Winter King's Gambit. Frederick V of the Palatinate was 23 years old and drunk on destiny. The leader of the Protestant Union, son-in-law to the King of England and now, improbably wonderfully, offered the crown of Bohemia. His advisors urged caution. His mother begged restraint. But his wife, the brilliant Elizabeth Stuart, saw glory in the gamble. "Better to eat sauerkraut as a queen," she declared, "than feast as an electress." The crowned heads of Europe watched with a mixture of horror and fascination as Frederick rode into Prague in the autumn of 1619. The city erupted in celebration, streets flooded with cheering Protestants who saw in this young prince their salvation from Habsburg dominion. The Gothic spires of the Hradčany castle witnessed lavish ceremonies as Frederick and Elizabeth were crowned King and Queen of Bohemia. In their apartments overlooking the Vltava River, they planned renovations, hosted balls, and dreamed of a Protestant empire in the heart of Europe. But in Vienna, Ferdinand II seethed. Now Holy Roman Emperor, he had not spent his life in devotion to the Catholic cause to watch heretics steal his hereditary lands. He dispatched letters to his Spanish cousins, to the Pope, to Maximilian of Bavaria. The responses came swiftly, promises of men, arms, and gold. The Catholic League mobilized under the brilliant general Johann Cercles, Count of Tilly. 40,000 men began their march north toward Prague. Frederick's court sparkled through that autumn of 1619. Elizabeth charmed ambassadors while Frederick hunted and feasted. But in quiet moments, disturbing reports arrived, massive armies gathering, allies hesitating, his own Protestant union refusing to support his Bohemian adventure. His father-in-law, James III of England, who could have shifted the balance with English power, instead wrote long, pedantic letters advising submission to imperial authority. Winter descended on Prague, and with it came the awakening from the dream. Spanish tercios were already securing the southern passes. Tilly's forces crossed into Bohemia. Frederick's amateur army, led by Christian of Anhalt, marched out to meet them in the rolling fields west of Prague. On November 8, 1620, as the morning mist lifted from White Mountain, Frederick sat down to breakfast. He would not finish the meal before his world collapsed, and with it, the fate of Protestant Bohemia. The Winter King's brief reign was about to earn its name, and Europe's nightmare was about to begin in earnest. The Catholic hammer falls. The Battle of White Mountain lasted exactly 1 hour. In that single hour, the fate of religious freedom in Central Europe was sealed for centuries to come. Tilly's veteran Catholic forces didn't just defeat Frederick's Protestant army, they shattered it. Christian of Anhalt watched in horror as his cavalry charge dissolved into chaos against the disciplined Spanish tercios. The Bohemian infantry, seeing their horsemen routed, simply turned and ran. In Prague, Frederick and Elizabeth were enjoying their breakfast when the first fugitives from the battlefield burst into the castle courtyard. The Winter King had time only to grab the crown jewels and his wife before fleeing the city. Elizabeth, 8 months pregnant, bounced in a carriage over frozen roads as Catholic armies poured into Prague behind them. The royal couple's flight would take them through Silesia, Brandenburg, and finally to the Dutch Republic, earning Elizabeth the nickname Queen of Hearts, and her husband a far less flattering sobriquet, the Winter King, who had ruled for a single season. The Habsburg vengeance was methodical and absolute. Ferdinand II's executioners worked through a long list of Bohemian nobles who had supported Frederick. 27 Protestant leaders were beheaded in Prague's Old Town Square on June 21, 1621. Their heads were displayed on the Charles Bridge. 12 of them would remain there for 10 years. The Letter of Majesty was ceremonially sliced to pieces by imperial officials. Protestant churches were closed or handed to Catholic orders, Protestant properties confiscated, Protestant families given a choice, convert or exile. Bavaria's Maximilian claimed the Upper Palatinate as his reward, while Spanish forces occupied Frederick's Rhine Palatinate. The shift in power was tectonic. The Habsburgs now controlled an unbroken chain of territory from the Spanish Netherlands to Hungary. Protestant princes across Germany watched in growing terror as Catholic armies moved at will through the empire. But it was the common people who suffered most. Spanish and Bavarian troops lived off the land, reducing whole districts to starvation. Villages that resisted were burned. The lucky ones fled. The rest learned to hide their Bibles and pray in secret. Yet even as Ferdinand celebrated his triumph, new actors were preparing to enter the stage. In Copenhagen, a Danish king eyed the chaos to the south and saw opportunity. In Stockholm, a young Swedish monarch studied reports of Habsburg expansion with growing alarm. And in Paris, a brilliant cardinal in a red robe considered how best to use Protestant desperation to further Catholic France's interests. The Battle of White Mountain had ended the Bohemian phase of the war, but it had also ensured the conflict would engulf all Europe. The true horrors were only beginning. Enter the north, the clash of Christian IV and Wallenstein. Christian IV of Denmark saw himself as the savior of Protestant Europe, though his motives weren't entirely holy. As Duke of Holstein, he was also a prince of the Holy Roman Empire, and Ferdinand's growing power threatened his interests. But it was the promise of valuable bishoprics in northern Germany that truly set his blue eyes gleaming. With English and Dutch subsidies filling his war chest, he marched south in 1625 with an army of 20,000 men, certain this would be his moment of glory. He hadn't counted on Albrecht von Wallenstein. This Bohemian noble had risen from Protestant roots to become Ferdinand's most brilliant commander and Europe's first military entrepreneur. Wallenstein didn't wait for imperial funding. He raised his own army through an innovative system of organized plunder, promising his officers spoils in exchange for their investment in his military machine. His force of 50,000 men was an army like none seen before, a massive self-sustaining engine of war that lived off conquered territories and grew larger with each victory. The clash between Christian's traditional army and Wallenstein's revolutionary force transformed northern Germany into a wasteland. At Lutter in 1626, Tilly smashed the Danish army while Wallenstein's forces seized control of the Baltic ports. Christian IV fled back to Denmark, his dreams of glory shattered. But Wallenstein wasn't finished. His army swelled to 100,000 men, the largest Europe had seen since the Roman Empire. He seized Mecklenburg for himself, was made duke of its territories, and began building a fleet to control the Baltic Sea. Ferdinand de Sanctu had never been more powerful. His armies dominated Germany from the Alps to the Baltic. But his very success sparked new fears. The German princes, both Protestant and Catholic, watched Wallenstein's growing power with alarm. His troops extorted massive contributions from cities and territories, regardless of their religion. In Vienna, courtiers whispered in Ferdinand's ear about his general's ambitions. Was Wallenstein loyal to the emperor, they asked, or to himself? Far to the north, in Sweden's capital of Stockholm, a young king named Gustavus Adolphus received increasingly desperate appeals from the German Protestant princes. He watched as Wallenstein's forces approached the Baltic, threatening Sweden's vital interests. In his war room, surrounded by maps and reports, Gustavus began planning the most ambitious military expedition yet seen in the war. Wallenstein's reign of terror was about to meet its match, and the 30 Years' War was about to enter its most dramatic and revolutionary phase. The Lion of the North. Gustavus Adolphus led his fleet into the port of Peenemünde on a summer day in 1630, the Swedish king himself standing at the bow of his flagship. As his boots touched German soil, he dropped to his knees and prayed. His officers exchanged worried glances. They had never seen their warrior king display such emotion. But Gustavus knew what was at stake. The fate of Protestant Europe now rested on his shoulders, and with it, control of the Baltic Sea, Sweden's lifeline. The Lion of the North brought with him more than divine conviction. His army was a revolution in motion. Where other forces were weighed down by pike formations and heavy cavalry, Gustavus had created something entirely new. Light, mobile infantry armed with matchlock muskets, supported by lightweight artillery that could be rapidly repositioned during battle. His Swedish and Finnish cavalry had perfected the technique of caracole, discharging pistols at close range before drawing swords. These were professional soldiers, drilled relentlessly, paid regularly, and held to strict discipline. The culmination came at Breitenfeld in September 1631. Tilly's Catholic forces, confident in their traditional tactics, crashed against the Swedish lines like a wave against a cliff. Gustavus's artillery tore holes in the imperial tercios, while his musketeers maintained a deadly rolling fire. When Tilly launched his cavalry, the Swedes didn't break. They reformed into smaller units, what Gustavus called commanded shot, devastating the Catholic horse with concentrated musket volleys. By day's end, Tilly's supposedly invincible army was in ruins, and military science had entered a new era. The Protestant princes who had hesitated to support Gustavus now flocked to his banner. The Swedish army surged south, liberating Protestant territories and extracting heavy contributions from Catholic ones. Gustavus entered Munich itself, dining in Maximilian's palace while his troops methodically looted the city's treasures. The Catholic collapse seemed complete when Tilly, trying to prevent the Swedes from crossing the Lech River, was struck by a cannonball. The great general who had never lost a battle before Breitenfeld died of his wounds, and with him seemed to die Catholic hopes. But in Vienna, Ferdinand II made the most difficult decision of his reign. Swallowing his pride, he recalled Wallenstein, whom he had dismissed under political pressure just 2 years earlier. The Generalissimo agreed to return only after extracting unprecedented concessions: absolute control over military operations, the right to negotiate peace, and the promise of one of the Habsburg hereditary lands as his reward. As 1632 dawned, Europe's two greatest commanders, the mercenary duke and the warrior king, began their deadly dance across the German countryside. The war was about to reach its dramatic climax in the freezing mists of Lutzen. The Cardinals' War. Cardinal Richelieu stood at his map table in Paris, his red robes gliding over the floorboards as he positioned markers representing armies across Europe. A Catholic cardinal plotting to aid Protestant princes, the irony was not lost on him. But Richelieu saw a greater threat than religious heresy: Habsburg power. The Spanish road from Milan to the Netherlands had become a noose around France's neck, and he intended to cut it. France's entry into the war marked the final transformation of Europe's religious crusade into a naked struggle for power. Richelieu's agents spread across Germany, offering French gold to any prince willing to resist Habsburg authority. Catholic Bavaria found itself wooed by Catholic France, while Protestant Sweden accepted papal subsidies filtered through French bankers. The Cardinals' greatest triumph came in negotiations with Catholic Spain's traditional allies, the Protestant Dutch. In a masterpiece of diplomatic manipulation, he convinced them to coordinate their attacks with France, creating a two-front war against the Habsburgs. The Spanish were the first to feel the bite of Richelieu's strategy. French armies struck through the Pyrenees while Dutch forces renewed their offensive in the Netherlands. In Germany, French gold paid for armies led by the mercenary Bernard of Saxe-Weimar, who carved out his own principality in Alsace. The Habsburgs found themselves fighting on every frontier, their resources stretched to the breaking point. Ferdinand II, who had begun the war as a crusader for the Catholic faith, spent his final years watching helplessly as a Catholic power dismantled his life's work. But Richelieu's war proved as costly for France as for its enemies. French peasants, crushed by taxes to pay for foreign armies, erupted in dozens of local revolts. Spanish tercios raided deep into French territory, at one point coming close enough to Paris for the smoke of their campfires to be visible from the city walls. The cardinal faced countless plots against his life, some backed by the Spanish, others by France's own nobility, and several supported by Louis XIII's own queen, Anne of Austria, who never forgave Richelieu for turning France against her Habsburg relatives. When Richelieu died in 1642, Followed shortly by Louis XIII, he left a mixed legacy to his protege, Cardinal Mazarin, and the 5-year-old Louis XIV. France was on the verge of becoming Europe's dominant power, but it was also on the verge of bankruptcy and civil war. The warfare he had funded in Germany had reduced much of Central Europe to a wasteland where wolves hunted in the ruins of abandoned villages. Yet Richelieu had achieved his primary goal. The Habsburg Empire, which had threatened to dominate Europe at the war's beginning, was now fighting for its survival. The continent's political center had shifted from Madrid and Vienna to Paris, where a young king was growing up who would complete what Richelieu had begun. Hell on earth. In the spring of 1631, Magdeburg was one of the largest and wealthiest cities in Germany. By summer, it was a charnel house. Tilly's forces had breached the walls after a lengthy siege, and what followed became a byword for horror, even in this brutal war. The imperial troops went mad with bloodlust, slaughtering 20,000 civilians in a single day. The fires they set burned so fiercely that victims who sought refuge in cellars were roasted alive. When Tilly finally entered the smoking ruins, he found a city of corpses. "Nothing more terrible has happened in the history of mankind," he wrote, though he had given the order that unleashed the carnage. But Magdeburg was just one horror in a landscape of nightmares. Armies had grown too large to be supplied by any one state or region. Instead, they lived off the land, descending on communities like swarms of locusts. When food ran out in one area, they moved to another, leaving behind stripped fields and starving populations. Soldiers' wives and camp followers often outnumbered the troops themselves, creating mobile cities of up to 50,000 people that devoured everything in their path. The collapse of civil society brought an older enemy, plague. As populations weakened by malnutrition huddled in fortress towns to escape marauding armies, disease swept through their ranks. Württemberg lost 3/4 of its population. In Brandenburg, half the houses stood empty. Across Germany, desperate peasants fled to the forests, living like animals, eating bark and roots. When even these ran out, there were whispered stories of darker means of survival. The war destroyed more than lives. It erased entire ways of life. Village traditions that had existed since medieval times vanished as communities disappeared. Municipal records, family histories, works of art, and religious relics were burned or looted. Soldiers melted down church bells for cannon, stripped copper roofs for ammunition, and burned ancient woodwork for cooking fires. Skills passed down through generations of craftsmen died with their last practitioners. Some regions of Germany would take 2 centuries to recover their pre-war population levels. Yet amidst the apocalypse, pockets of civilization endured. In Hamburg, a group of merchants created a new form of financial institution, the public bank, to protect their wealth from marauding armies. In the free city of Nuremberg, artists continued to produce works of stunning beauty. And in thousands of hidden places, ordinary people risked death to shelter refugees, preserve books and artifacts, and keep alive the embers of human decency. When peace finally came, it would be these survivors who would begin the monumental task of rebuilding not just Germany's cities and villages, but the very fabric of European society. The long road to peace. In the German cities of Münster and Osnabrück, 200 diplomats gathered in 1644 to attempt the impossible, ending a war that had become a way of life for an entire generation. The negotiations that would become the Peace of Westphalia were unlike anything Europe had seen before. Catholics and Protestants worked in separate cities to avoid protocol disputes, while messengers galloped between them carrying proposals and counter-proposals. The French insisted on negotiating in their own language rather than Latin, a shocking break with diplomatic tradition that signaled the birth of a new international order. These negotiations were a dance of deadly complexity. Swedish diplomats demanded satisfaction for their war costs, while French representatives worked to ensure Germany remained divided and weak. German princes, both Protestant and Catholic, jockeyed for territorial compensation. The Spanish, fighting their own war with France, sought a separate peace that would let them focus on crushing Dutch independence. In the background lurked the Ottoman Empire, whose agents watched with keen interest as their Christian rivals exhausted themselves. The breakthrough came not in the grand halls of diplomacy, but in a series of private meetings between French and Austrian negotiators. Count Maximilian von Trautmannsdorf, Ferdinand III's chief diplomat, finally convinced his emperor that the old dream of a unified Catholic Germany under Habsburg rule was dead. On the French side, Abel Servian crafted language that would let each side claim victory while fundamentally transforming the nature of European politics. The Holy Roman Empire would survive, but its powers were fatally weakened. German princes gained nearly complete sovereignty, including the right to make foreign alliances. The principle of cuius regio, eius religio, whose realm, his religion, was reaffirmed, but with a crucial new protection for religious minorities. When the final documents were signed in October 1648, they did more than end a war. They created the framework for modern international relations. State sovereignty became the foundation of European politics. Religious authority was subordinated to secular power. International law began to emerge as a real force in relations between states. The delegations had spent 4 years arguing over everything from titles and precedents to the shape of the negotiating tables, but in doing so, they had invented modern diplomacy. The costs had been astronomical. 8 million dead. Thousands of towns and villages destroyed. Entire regions depopulated. Germany's population would not recover to pre-war levels until 1750. But from this apocalypse emerged a new European order, one based not on universal empire or religious uniformity, but on a balance of power between sovereign states. The medieval dream of a unified Christian Europe under Pope and Emperor was finally dead. The modern world of nation-states had begun. The birth of the modern international order. History pivots on moments that few recognize at the time. As the exhausted diplomats left Münster and Osnabrück in the autumn of 1648, none fully grasped that they had just created the basic framework of international relations that would endure into the 21st century. The ideas born in those negotiations, state sovereignty, diplomatic immunity, collective security, religious tolerance, would shape every major treaty and international organization for centuries to come, from the Congress of Vienna to the United Nations. The war's survivors emerged into a transformed world. The Habsburg dream of universal monarchy was shattered, replaced by a Europe of sovereign states jealously guarding their independence. France, not Spain, would dominate the continent for the next century. Sweden gained control of the Baltic, becoming a great power overnight. The Dutch Republic's independence was finally recognized, launching its golden age of commerce and art. But the greatest transformation was psychological medieval concepts of universal authority, whether spiritual or temporal, had given way to modern ideas of state power and international law. In the devastated German lands, the war left a legacy of deep distrust toward ideological absolutism and religious extremism. The German princes, their powers now vastly expanded, began building the centralized bureaucracies and standing armies that would eventually transform into modern states. The peasants who emerged from the forests found a world where authority derived not from divine right, but from treaties and laws. The old certainties were gone, replaced by something more complex but ultimately more stable, a system where power was balanced, sovereignty was respected, and diplomacy replaced religious conviction as the currency of international relations. That system would be tested many times in the centuries to come by Louis XIV's ambitions, by revolutionary France, by Prussia's rise, by 2 world wars. But the basic principles established at Westphalia would endure. When modern diplomats gather to negotiate peace treaties or debate in the UN Security Council, they're following procedures first established in those German cities in 1648. The 30 Years' War had destroyed the medieval world. From its ashes, our modern international order was born. Would you like me to continue with any other aspects of the war or expand on any particular themes? We could explore specific battles in more detail, delve deeper into the key personalities, or examine the war's lasting impact on specific regions or aspects of society.